At the edge of the Louisiana bayou, where the air was thick with the perfume of wet earth and decay, stood Bellefontaine, a mansion so grand and silent it seemed to hold its breath. Cypress trees bowed over its roof, their long moss fingers swaying like ghosts mourning a forgotten era. The windows were tall and clouded, veiling what lay inside, while the veranda creaked with the weight of stories the house refused to tell. Each morning, as mist curled over the stagnant water, a figure moved through that silence, a young woman named Ruth. She walked with her head bowed, her hands clutching a small sewing basket, her steps barely whispering on the dew-wet steps. The servants said she came from the northern edge of the parish, alone, with no kin, no history, and no words to spare. She never spoke of the life she had before Bellefontaine, and perhaps that was what made her presence so unsettling. Inside the mansion, she stitched in the room with the narrow window, the one that faced the bayou. Light fell through lace curtains, casting delicate patterns on her brown skin as her needle rose and fell, steady as breath. Her stitches were fine, almost too fine, and the gowns she created seemed to shimmer even when the room lay in shadow. Some said the house itself quieted when Ruth worked, as though listening to the rhythm of her needle, hypnotized by its pulse. Mrs. Genevieve Beauregard, mistress of Bellefontaine, was a woman of beauty and porcelain pride. She had inherited the estate from her late husband, along with the debts, the decay, and the desperate need to maintain appearances. Her reflection, always perfect, was her greatest obsession and her greatest fear. When Ruth was brought to her by the housekeeper, Mrs. Beauregard regarded her as one might a fine instrument, useful, silent, precise. "You'll sew in the East Room," she said, her tone both commandeur and test. "My gowns require devotion, not chatter." Ruth only nodded. She did not lower her gaze nor raise it. She simply stood still, her dark eyes unreadable. That stillness made Mrs. Beauregard uneasy, but it also made her trust the girl in a way she did not trust others. Under the mistress's supervision, Ruth worked endlessly. Silks, lace, mourning veils, ribbons for the season's balls. Every garment was meant to protect Mrs. Beauregard's image, to shield her from the whispering world beyond the iron gates. Yet, as weeks passed, Ruth's work began to take on a strange tone. The folds of her gowns seemed deeper, darker, their pleats falling like veils of shadow. The mistress wore them proudly, never realizing how much of herself she was hiding behind Ruth's thread. Beyond the polished halls, whispers stirred like restless spirits. In the servants' quarters by candlelight, the maids traded hushed stories about the seamstress. They said she never blinked when she sewed, that her lips moved as though murmuring prayers in a language no one knew, that she worked long after midnight, her window glowing faintly when all others were dark. "She doesn't talk because she's hiding something," said Clara, the laundress, her voice trembling. "No one stays silent that long unless they've made a deal with the devil." But old Henrietta, the cook, only shook her head. "Hush, girl. That one's seen things. You can see it in her eyes. Best let her be." Sometimes, when the maids crept past the sewing room, they heard faint humming, a tune without melody, soft as breath, that made the hairs on their arms rise. They said Ruth was humming to the house itself, lulling it, binding it, keeping its ghosts at rest. And yet, when she stopped, the house seemed to sigh. From her window, Ruth often watched the bayou, the slow, endless movement of the water, the silver ripples catching fragments of moonlight. No one knew what she saw there, but one night a servant swore she saw Ruth standing by the open window, her hand resting on the sill, her lips parting as though to speak. Then, as the wind moved through the cypress, the curtains fluttered, and the candlelight went out. By morning, Ruth was back at her table, sewing as though nothing had changed, but the whispers had. The servants began to call her the girl who listens to ghosts, and from that day forward, whenever her needle struck cloth, it sounded, faintly, like a heartbeat echoing through the halls of Bellefontaine. Night fell thick and heavy over Bellefontaine, swallowing the last blush of daylight into the humid breath of the Louisiana swamp. Inside, the mansion glowed faintly, a handful of candles flickering in high windows, their light trembling as if afraid of the dark pressing in. Ruth sat in her sewing room, her slender fingers dancing over black silk. The sound of her needle pierced the quiet like the ticking of a distant clock. Each stitch came with purpose, each pull of the thread a measured whisper. The air around her smelled of candle wax and damp wood, and beyond the cracked shutters, the cicadas sang their endless, fevered song. The mansion was sleeping, but Ruth, as always, was awake. They said the girl was tireless, but that wasn't true. She simply worked because she must. Because silence demanded movement, and the needle was her only voice. Tonight, the mistress had ordered something different, a mourning veil. Not for herself, she had said, but for her daughter. The words had fallen like frost in the warm air. The Beauregard's only child, Miss Evelyn, had died weeks earlier. No one spoke of how, only that she had taken ill after a fever that came me without warning, and left no trace but death. Ruth had not seen the young woman, but she felt her presence. The house held it. In the hollow stairwell, in the way the mirrors seemed to dim, and in the soft sobs that sometimes slipped from behind Mrs. Beauregard's door. When the mistress entered the sewing room that night, her gown whispered like wind through dry reeds. Her face was pale but perfect, her voice a controlled tremor. "It must be black," she said softly. "So dark it drinks the light. No lace, no shine, just absence." Ruth nodded, her eyes steady. The mistress studied her for a moment, as if searching for a question she did not dare ask. "You understand what it means to lose everything, don't you?" Ruth's hands paused on the fabric. Then she resumed sewing, slower now. The needle's silver tip caught the candlelight, flashing once, a tear of light in a sea of darkness. Mrs. Beauregard lingered, her gloved fingers tracing the edge of the work table. "My daughter was delicate," she whispered. "She had your patience, your quiet nature. Sometimes I think—" Her voice faltered. "Sometimes I think I hear her in these halls." Ruth looked up, her expression unreadable. "You'll finish by morning," the mistress ordered quickly, regaining her composure. "The funeral guests arrive at dawn." When she was gone, Ruth worked alone, her needle piercing the black cloth in steady rhythm. But as she stitched, the silence began to shift. The flame of the candle bent sharply, though no wind stirred. The lace curtains swayed as if something unseen brushed past. Then came a faint sound, a soft sigh from behind her, almost too quiet to be real. Ruth did not turn. She only kept sewing. The thread tugged tighter than before, pulling her finger against the needle's sharp tip. A bead of blood bloomed crimson against the black silk. She watched it spread slowly, like in water. Then, almost imperceptibly, the fabric beneath her hands seemed to move, a ripple, faint but alive. The house moaned, just once, like old timber shifting under the weight of something unseen. Outside, the wind rose through the cypress trees, and the swamp answered in low murmurs. Ruth stared at her work, at the black veil that seemed to drink her blood without trace. For the first time, her breath trembled. By dawn, the veil was complete. It lay across the table like a strip of shadow, lightless and soft as ash. When Mrs. Beauregard returned, she touched the fabric and drew her hand back sharply. "It's cold," she said. Ruth said nothing. The mistress hesitated, then lifted the veil, holding it to the light. No matter how she turned it, the silk refused to gleam. It absorbed the morning glow, devoured it, as if it preferred the dark. "Perfect," she murmured, half in awe, half in fear. "It's as though the girl herself is beneath it." Ruth looked toward the window. The first light of morning was breaking over the bayou, a gray shimmer over still water. Somewhere deep in that fog, something moved, something that watched. And as the church bells tolled in the distance, Ruth's fingers twitched. Her needle lay silent now, but in the hollow of her chest, she could still feel its rhythm. That slow, steady heartbeat of thread and shadow, echoing through the walls of Bellefontaine. The morning of the funeral dawned heavy and gray, the kind of light that feels like sorrow itself has settled in the air. Mist hung over the bayou like a burial shroud, swallowing the path that led to the Beauregard estate. The cypress trees stood still, their reflections trembling on the water's surface as if the earth itself was holding its breath. Inside Bellefontaine, candles flickered in narrow windows, the flames shivering against the chill that had crept through the house overnight. Servants moved like shadows, their voices hushed. The black-draped parlor smelled of wax, lilies, and something faintly metallic, the echo of blood or rust. At the center of it all lay the coffin of Miss Evelyn Beauregard, her face veiled beneath the very silk Ruth had sewn. Mrs. Beauregard stood beside it, her gloved hands trembling. The guests, dressed in their finest mourning attire, whispered their condolences with the polite horror of the Southern elite. They avoided Ruth, who lingered near the edge of the room, her head bowed. But some could not resist glancing at her, the silent girl who made the veil, the one the mistress refused to dismiss, even after tragedy. Outside, the funeral procession began its slow descent toward the family cemetery. The path wound between drooping oaks and the still black water of the bayou. Ruth followed at a distance, her bare feet soundless on the damp earth. The minister's words were swallowed by the thick air, and when the final prayer faded, the mourners turned back toward the mansion. All except Ruth. She remained by the grave long after the others had gone, her gaze fixed on the mound of fresh soil. The breeze shifted, carrying the faint scent of lilies and decay. Then, from the edge of the trees, she saw him, a man standing half-hidden among the moss-draped branches. He wore a dark coat, old and worn, his hat low over his eyes, but even from afar, Ruth could feel his gaze on her, heavy, knowing, like a memory trying to claw its way back. When she blinked, he was gone, leaving only ripples in the still bayou water. That night, the air inside Bellefontaine thickened again. The house groaned as if settling deeper into the earth. Mrs. Beauregard locked herself away, her grief turning inward, sharp and feverish. But Ruth, as always, worked. She lit a single candle in the sewing room, its flame trembling as she threaded her needle. The veil she had made for the mistress's daughter lay folded beside her, dark and cold. The sound of the thread pulling through silk filled the silence, a sound that seemed to echo off the walls. Then the shadows began to move. At first, it was only the flutter of curtains, but when Ruth raised her eyes, she saw faint shapes shifting in the glass of the window, reflections that did not belong to her. One moment, she was alone. The next, she swore she saw the faint outline of a girl standing behind her chair, her face obscured by a black veil. Ruth turned slowly. The room was empty. The candlelight bent low, nearly extinguished, then flared high again. She whispered, not words, but a soft exhale of breath that felt like surrender. Her hand trembled as she reached for the veil. For just an instant, the fabric felt alive beneath her fingers, pulsing faintly with warmth, or something far colder. Downstairs, the old grandfather clock struck midnight, its chime echoing through the hollow halls, and from somewhere deep in the house, perhaps the parlor, perhaps the staircase, came a sound, a faint, dragging rustle, like silk sliding across the floor. Ruth rose slowly, the candlelight flickering across her face. Her eyes drifted toward the door, but she did not move. The sound grew louder, closer, until it stopped just outside the sewing room. A shadow passed under the door, then silence. The house seemed to listen. Ruth's heart beat once, twice, and then the candle went out. The next morning, the servants whispered of strange noises in the night, of footsteps where no one walked, of mirrors fogging without cause. Mrs. Beauregard dismissed it all as superstition, yet when she entered Ruth's sewing room, she found the black veil lying unfolded across the table again, as if someone, or something, had been wearing it. And outside, by the edge of the bayou, a single footprint pressed into the mud, smaller than Ruth's, delicate and bare, leading straight toward the water. There was a room in Bellefontaine that no servant entered willingly, the mirror room, a chamber gilded in gold, leaf and hung with portraits of women whose painted eyes seemed to follow one's every move. In the center stood a vanity made of mahogany and mother of pearl, its mirror tall enough to show a woman's reflection in full. It was said that Mrs. Beauregard went there before every ball, every luncheon, every Sunday sermon, and that she emerged from it colder, sharper, somehow less human each time. Ruth had never been summoned there until that day. The air smelled faintly of rosewater and burnt sugar as she entered, her bare feet pressing against polished floors that reflected the light like still water. Mrs. Beauregard stood before the mirror, her corset laced tight, a silk gown pulled at her feet. "You will mend this," she said, not turning around. Her tone carried both command and exhaustion, the kind that comes from chasing perfection too long. Ruth approached quietly, gathering the torn seam near the shoulder where the silk had frayed. Her fingers worked like a whisper, so soft that even the ticking clock seemed to pause. Mrs. Beauregard watched her reflection instead of her. "You don't speak," she murmured, almost to herself. "Not a word, ever. Is it fear that holds your tongue, or something else?" Ruth did not answer. She never did. Her silence was a language of its own, one Mrs. Beauregard could not translate, and that irritated her deeply. "They say you hear things," the mistress continued, "that you know when someone is lying, that you can tell who sneaks out at night, who steals the sugar, who curses my name." Her eyes met Ruth's in the mirror then. Two pairs of eyes, one proud and pale, one dark and steady. For a long moment, the air seemed to tremble. Outside, the bayou's wind pressed against the shutters, and a loose pane clicked faintly, like distant knuckles rapping at glass. Ruth's needle flashed in the dim light, her reflection bending and straightening with each stroke. Mrs. Beauregard's voice softened. "My husband says mirrors don't lie, but I see lies every time I look." Ruth's hand paused, just for an instant, then continued. The mistress turned abruptly, silk whispering across the floor. "What did you see just now?" she demanded. "In that reflection. Tell me." Still, Ruth said nothing. Mrs. Beauregard's breath hitched, half rage, half despair. "You think yourself above me because you say nothing," she hissed. "But silence is not virtue, it's a mask." The needle stopped. Ruth looked up, meeting her eyes, not through the mirror this time, but face to face. No words passed between them, only the echo of a truth too heavy for speech, that both women were trapped in the same gilded cage, only wearing different chains. That night, Ruth returned to her small attic room above the kitchen. The moonlight fell through the slats and spilled across her sewing table, illuminating a small piece of broken mirror she had kept hidden in her workbox, a shard she'd found near the parlor weeks ago. She turned it in her hand, watching the silver edge catch the light. The reflection that stared back was not hers. Not exactly. The eyes looked older, sadder, as if they'd seen too much. Somewhere below, Mrs. Beauregard's laughter rang out, brittle as ice, echoing up the staircase. Ruth wrapped the mirror piece in cloth and tucked it beneath her pillow. That night, she dreamed of a woman standing in a field of torn lace, her face covered by a veil that shimmered like water, and when the woman turned, it was Mrs. Beauregard, but her mouth was sewn shut. The next morning, when Ruth came down to the parlor, the great mirror in the vanity was cracked clean through the center. Mrs. Beauregard stood before it, trembling. "Fetch the overseer," she whispered. "Someone's been in my room." Ruth curtsied softly, her eyes lowered. But as she turned away, the faintest smile touched her lips, a seam stitched between fear and knowing. The crack in the mirror changed everything at Bellefontaine. Mrs. Beauregard's laughter vanished. Her dinners grew quiet, her steps sharper, her temper unpredictable. The house became a place of whispers and reflections, servants gliding past one another with downcast eyes, afraid to draw the mistress's attention. It was a week after the mirror shattered that the portrait came down. The east parlor had always been Mrs. Beauregard's sanctuary, a sunlit room filled with velvet chairs and heavy drapes that smelled of lavender and dust. On its far wall hung a grand painting of her as a young bride, pale, beautiful, and serene, her gaze turned toward the horizon as if she awaited something noble. Mr. Beauregard, stiff and ghostly beside her, had been painted with a hand that lacked affection. That afternoon, Ruth was called to mend the draperies. When she entered, she found Mrs. Beauregard standing before the portrait, her eyes wide and trembling. A deep tear slashed across the painted bride's throat, a ragged, violent wound that had not been there before. "Do you see it?" Mrs. Beauregard whispered, her voice hoarse. "Someone's done this." Ruth said nothing, setting down her sewing basket. The mistress's reflection shimmered faintly on the glass of the ruined painting. "No one but the servants comes in here," she continued, pacing now. "And I locked the doors last night myself." The silence between them stretched. Outside, cicadas sang their endless dirge. Then, as if something inside her had snapped, Mrs. Beauregard seized a letter opener from the desk and tore it across the canvas again, through her own painted face this time. The sound was dry and final, like paper surrendering to fire. "There," she said breathlessly. "Now it matches." Ruth flinched. For a brief moment she saw something in the mistress's eyes, not madness, but terror. A woman haunted not by ghosts, but by her own reflection. The sound of footsteps broke the moment. It was Mr. Beauregard, returning from his study, his expression sour with drink. "What in God's name?" he began, then saw the damage. His voice dropped to a low, dangerous growl. "Are you out of your mind?" Mrs. Beauregard turned toward him, trembling. "It wasn't me, it was—" She looked to Ruth, but Ruth's eyes remained fixed on the torn portrait. The master followed her gaze, then sneered. "The girl, don't be absurd. She hasn't the courage to lift her eyes, let alone a knife." Ruth lowered her head, hands clasped tightly before her apron. She could feel both of their gazes pressing against her, one burning with accusation, the other with suspicion. Mr. Beauregard moved closer to the painting, running his finger along the torn edge. "This costs more than your dowry," he muttered. "If you can't keep your own temper, Clarissa, I'll start locking you out of this room myself." Mrs. Beauregard turned pale. She opened her mouth, then closed it again. When he left, the air seemed to deflate. Ruth quietly knelt to gather the scraps of fallen canvas, folding them neatly. Mrs. Beauregard watched her in silence, eyes darting between the torn portrait and Ruth's calm, deliberate hands. At last she spoke, her voice a whisper of glass on stone. "Do you believe in curses, Ruth?" Ruth's fingers paused only for a second before resuming. The mistress continued, "My mother told me beauty is borrowed, that if a woman steals too much of it from the world takes it back, piece by piece." Ruth rose slowly, her gaze steady and unreadable. Then she turned toward the window, where the last light of afternoon filtered through the heavy drapes like dust through water. Behind her, Mrs. Beauregard touched the ruined portrait once more. A loose thread of canvas caught on her ring and drew blood, a single crimson bead that slid down too. He painted Bride's face like a tear. That night, Ruth sat in her attic with a candle burning low. She took a scrap of linen from her workbox and stitched a small, delicate X through its center, the mark of something lost, or perhaps something bound. Down below, in the east parlor, the torn portrait swayed slightly in the draft, though no wind stirred the room. The dawn after the portrait's desecration arrived heavy with fog. The bayou's breath clung to the veranda, and Bellefontaine seemed to shiver beneath it, its white pillars streaked gray by the mist, its silence dense and waiting. Ruth was already at her station in the sewing room, a candle guttering beside her needle. The air was cold enough to make her fingers ache, yet she worked with the same patient rhythm, thread whispering through cloth. But that morning, the cloth was not linen, it was silk, pale, expensive, and soft as skin. Mrs. Beauregard had given it to her with trembling hands, whispering that she needed a new gown for the spring gathering. "It must be perfect," she'd said. "Flawless, no blood on the seam." Ruth had nodded, though something in that warning clung to her, as if the mistress feared not the stain, but the omen. As the hours passed, the candle burned low, and Ruth's movements slowed. Her hands were steady, yet a small tremor ran through her right thumb. The needle pricked her skin, a sharp sting, and a single drop of blood bloomed against the white silk like a dark rose. She stared at it for a long moment. The droplets spread along the threads, almost pulsing, and then, impossibly, it seemed to vanish, drawn into the fabric as though swallowed. Ruth pressed the spot again, frowning, but it was gone. Only the faintest shadow remained, as if the silk had drunk her pain. That night, Mrs. Beauregard appeared in the doorway of the sewing room. Her eyes were wild, sleepless, ringed with gray. "You're still at it?" she murmured. Ruth rose and offered the gown in silence. The candlelight flickered across its surface, turning it ghostly. The mistress took it in her hands, then froze. What color thread did you use for the hem? White, Ruth said softly. Mrs. Beauregard turned the gown toward the light. It isn't white anymore. Along the lower seam, where Ruth had worked, the thread had darkened, faintly pink at first, then deepening toward the hue of dried blood. The mistress's breath caught. Did you? But she stopped herself. Her gaze darted toward the window, toward something unseen. No, she whispered. It's this house. It's this place. When she turned back, Ruth's face was calm, unreadable. There was no trace of fear, only understanding. She took the gown gently from the mistress's hands and set it upon the table. Do you believe it's cursed? Mrs. Beauregard asked suddenly. Ruth did not answer. The mistress stepped closer. I see the way you look at the walls. You hear them, don't you? The whispers at night, the laughter that isn't laughter. Outside, thunder rumbled far away, rolling across the swamp like a warning. Tell me, Ruth, the mistress pleaded, if there are ghosts here, what do they want from me? Ruth lifted her eyes then, soft brown eyes that carried something older than fear. Not you, she said quietly. The words struck the air like a bell. Mrs. Beauregard's lips trembled. Then who? Ruth said nothing more. She returned to her chair, took up the needle again, and began to sew. The thread glimmered faintly red in the candlelight, as though it remembered what it had drunk. That night, when the storm finally broke, the mansion groaned under the weight of rain. Servants huddled in their quarters, whispering that the mistress had begun to sleepwalk again, wandering barefoot through the halls, her nightdress trailing behind her like a bridal veil. Ohm claimed they saw her pause at Ruth's door, staring in through the keyhole before vanishing into the dark. In the attic, Ruth lay awake, her hands folded over her chest. The stormlight flashed through the small window, illuminating the sewing table beside her bed, and the gown upon it. The red seams glimmered softly, pulsing in rhythm with the thunder. By morning, the storm had passed. The sun rose pale and thin, the bayou steaming. When the servants came downstairs, they found the sewing room door ajar, the candle long dead. On the table sat the finished gown, folded neatly, and on its hem, where the blood-dark thread had been, a single word was stitched in letters so small they could barely be seen. Remember. The morning of the spring gathering dawned with a deceptive calm. The mist that had lingered over the bayou finally began to lift, revealing Bellefontaine in all its splendor. Columns scrubbed white, silver trays polished to mirror brightness, and bouquets of magnolia arranged in every room to mask the scent of mildew that clung to the house like memory. By mid-morning, carriages began to arrive. The guests, planters, merchants, and women in silk gloves, filled the veranda with laughter that carried the brittle ring of practiced charm. From the upstairs window, Ruth watched silently, her hands folded against her apron. The gown she had sewn for Mrs. Beauregard shimmered faintly in the sunlight as the mistress stepped out to greet her guests, its pale silk rippling like water, the faint red seams nearly invisible. Magnificent, someone whispered as she passed. She looks 10 years younger. Mrs. Beauregard smiled, though her eyes betrayed a strange stillness. To her, the compliments sounded distant, muffled by the heavy air. She felt the gown cling to her like a second skin, soft but faintly warm, as though it remembered the touch of the one who had made it. Inside, the servants moved like shadows, ferrying wine, fruit, and music through the rooms. Ruth lingered near the back hall, watching the reflections in the parlor's mirrors. Each shimmered slightly out of sync with the people they portrayed. A moment behind, a gesture delayed, a smile that lingered too long. Then came the music. A waltz, slow and graceful, filled the grand room. Mrs. Beauregard moved to the center, her laughter rising above the chatter. For a moment, she seemed radiant again, the perfect hostess, the belle of Bellefontaine. But as she turned, the hem of her gown caught against a loose nail in the floorboards. There was a faint tearing sound. She froze. A few guests gasped as the seam split along her side. Not enough to reveal, but enough to startle. The pink-red thread had come undone, the stitches fraying in a slow, deliberate line. "Is something wrong, Clarissa?" asked Mrs. Langtry, her oldest friend. Mrs. Beauregard forced a smile. "Just a loose stitch," she said, clutching her shawl tighter, but her face had gone pale. She could feel the warmth spreading beneath the silk, a slow heat blooming where the thread unraveled. She excused herself and hurried toward the stairs. The laughter behind her dimmed, replaced by murmurs. At the top of the staircase, Ruth waited, silent, hands clasped. "Fetch my sewing kit," the mistress hissed. "Quickly." Ruth nodded and followed her into the bedroom. Once the door shut, the world outside disappeared. Only the sound of the clock remained, steady, ticking, accusing. Mrs. Beauregard turned to face the mirror, breath shallow. The seam had widened, not torn but opened, as though something beneath the silk was pushing outward. "Fix it," she whispered. "Now." Ruth approached with needle and thread, but paused when she saw the fabric. The red stitching had begun to rise, forming faint words that woo, and along the gown's edge. Mrs. Beauregard stared at them, uncomprehending. "What is it saying?" she demanded. Ruth's voice was almost a whisper. "Names." The mistress leaned closer. There they were. Tiny letters stitched in blood-dark thread, looping together in a single sentence. "We remember." Mrs. Beauregard's hand flew to her mouth. "Who? Who are they?" But Ruth did not answer. The candlelight flickered, and in the mirror behind them, the room seemed deeper. Shadows lengthening, shapes stirring in corners where none should be. Then the window burst open. The wind swept through, scattering papers, extinguishing the flame. Mrs. Beauregard screamed, clutching at the gown, trying to tear it from her body. "Get it off!" she cried. "Get it off!" Ruth stood still as the silk ripped and fell in tatters around her mistress's feet. When the wind finally died, the room fell silent again. Mrs. Beauregard sank to her knees, trembling, the words still faintly visible on the torn fabric. Ruth bent down, picked up a single strip of silk, and folded it carefully. "You cannot tear away what is already written," she said softly. The mistress looked up, eyes wide with terror. But Ruth was already walking toward the door, the folded silk pressed to her chest. Downstairs the music had resumed, unaware that upstairs the seam between past and present had finally begun to unravel. The celebration at Bellefontaine ended in silence. The guests departed in hurried whispers, sensing something unspoken, a heaviness in the air that no candlelight could dispel. By dusk the mansion stood half in shadow, its shutters closed, its laughter gone. Only the servants remained, moving quietly through the halls like mourners at a wake. Ruth did not join them. She stayed in the attic, the folded strip of silk resting beside her candle. The faint words embroidered in it, "We remember," shimmered when the flame bent low as though breathing. Below in the mistress's chambers, Mrs. Beauregard sat motionless before her mirror. Her face was pale and drawn, her once perfect hair tangled. The gown she had worn lay in a heap beside her chair, its pieces darkened as if soaked in rust. Every so often, she would lift one fragment, tracing the thread with trembling fingers, whispering the words again and again. "We remember." It echoed through her head like a prayer or a curse. By midnight, she rang for Ruth. The sound of the bell carried faintly through the upper floors, sharp and insistent. Ruth descended without haste, candle in hand, her face calm. When she entered the room, she found the mistress surrounded by candlelight, a circle of small flames that cast her in trembling gold. On the vanity stood a decanter of brandy and a small silver box. "Close the door," Mrs. Beauregard said. Her voice was low, almost kind. Ruth obeyed. The mistress looked up at her, eyes red-rimmed but lucid. "Do you know why I hired you, Ruth?" she asked. Ruth shook her head. "I saw you once," the mistress continued, staring into the mirror. "Years ago, you were a child then, standing behind your mother outside the old market on Chartres Street. She sold lacework, the kind my mother used to buy. And I remember thinking, she smiled faintly, those hands, so quiet, so patient. Ruth's voice was soft. My mother is gone now. Yes, the mistress said, and her smile faded. So are many others. She reached for the silver box, opened it, and revealed a lock of dark hair tied with ribbon, brittle with age. This belonged to her, she said. I kept it. I don't know why. Ruth's breath caught. For the first time, the calm in her eyes trembled. Mrs. Beauregard went on, almost in a whisper. Your mother worked for mine, long before you came here. She sewed the curtains in this room. She died before the war. In this house, the words fell like stones into water. Ruth's fingers tightened around her candle. The flame shivered. How? The mistress hesitated. Her reflection in the mirror looked younger, frightened. It was an accident, she said. A fire in the washroom. I was a girl. I didn't mean to. Her voice cracked. But she was trapped. My mother forbade me to speak of it. Said the Lord would forgive if I never told. The silence that followed was absolute. The only sound was the faint hiss of the candle flame. Ruth set her candle down on the vanity beside the torn silk. You kept her hair, she said quietly. You kept her name silent. The mistress closed her eyes. If there's any mercy left in this world, Ruth, burn it. Burn it all. The gown, the hair, the letters. Let the house forget. But Ruth only stared at her. The house does not forget, she said. It listens. Then she lifted her candle and turned toward the drapes. The flame brushed the fabric, and in a breath, fire bloomed. Soft at first, then fierce, climbing like a living thing. Mrs. Beauregard screamed, stumbling backward. What have you done? Ruth did not answer. The fire spread fast, devouring the curtains, crawling toward the portrait on the far wall. The painted bride's face blackened and curled. When the servants came running, the air was thick with smoke. They found Ruth standing in the doorway. The mistress collapsed at her feet, her eyes wide and hollow. Outside, the bayou flickered red with reflection, and as the roof beams began to groan, Ruth stepped into the courtyard, her silhouette framed by flame. In her hands, she still carried the strip of silk, unburned, untouched, the last piece of a story the house could never silence. By dawn, Bellefontaine was nothing more than a smoldering skeleton. The air was heavy with ash and memory. The grand white columns stood blackened and cracked, the once golden drapes now ribbons of soot clinging to broken windows. The bayou, calm and pale, mirrored the ruin, a mansion reduced to bone and shadow. The townsfolk came by midday, drawn by the column of smoke that rose above the cypress. They whispered as they picked their way through the wreckage, their shoes crunching over glass and burnt lace. Some crossed themselves. Others said the house had burned from lightning, or divine justice, or the devil himself. But Ruth was gone. No one had seen her leave, and no one could say where she went. Only one servant claimed he saw her silhouette moving through the fog at dawn, walking toward the marsh with a strip of white cloth trailing from her hand. Though by the time he looked again, she'd vanished among the reeds. Mrs. Beauregard survived, though barely. They found her near the reflecting pond, her hair singed, her eyes open but unseeing. She didn't speak for days. When at last she did, her words chilled even the doctor who tended her. She was smiling, she whispered. The fire. It didn't touch her. The physician said it was shock, fever, the rambling of a mind undone by terror. But in the nights that followed, others began to hear things too. The groundskeeper swore that from the ruins, faint stitching sounds echoed after midnight, a needle's whisper, passing through cloth. Another servant heard humming, low, slow, like a lullaby without words. And then there were the ashes. Each morning, the housekeeper swept what remained of the parlor's floor, and every morning she found something new. Fragments of white thread curled like veins, woven into the soot. One day she found a small square of linen, edges burned but intact. On it were stitched 2 words in blood-red thread, "She knows." When word reached the town, the story grew. The people of Natchez began to call it the Seamstress's fire. They said a servant girl had cursed her mistress for a sin buried too deep. that the flame was not of this world. Some swore the girl's spirit still wandered the bayou, needle in hand, mending what the fire could not erase. Weeks later, a preacher came from Baton Rouge, determined to cleanse the land. He stood before the blackened steps of Bellefontaine, Bible in hand, and called out into the ruins, "Ruth, if your soul is unclean, leave this place and trouble it no more." The wind answered him, soft, almost tender. The ash stirred around his boots, swirling in faint spirals. For a moment, it seemed to rise into the shape of a woman, head bowed, hands folded. The preacher stumbled back, crossing himself, and the ash fell still again. By summer, the Beauregard family fled the estate. Mrs. Beauregard never recovered her reason. She lived her final years in a boarding house upriver, muttering to invisible hands and staring endlessly at a square of cloth she kept folded in her lap. When she died, the maid who washed her things found the fabric embroidered with a new word, faint and trembling: wait. As for the ruins of Bellefontaine, nature crept back to claim them. The vines grew thick over the pillars, moss swallowing the stones. The bayou, slow and patient, erased the boundaries between house and earth. But even now, travelers who pass that stretch of water say that when the mist rises at dusk, they hear a woman humming and see a faint light flickering where the sewing room once stood. Some say it's Ruth, still at her work, stitching the torn pieces of memory back together, mending the veil between the living and the dead. Others say it's just the wind in the cypress, but those who've heard the voice for themselves never speak of it twice. A month after the fire, the bayou had returned to its slow rhythm, frogs croaking, cicadas shrieking, and the water reflecting the bruised sky. The townsfolk, though, could not forget. Bellefontaine had become a scar on the land, and no one dared to walk its grounds after dusk. But stories have a way of surviving the flames, and one story began to spread like a soft wind through the cypress, the sighting of a girl by the water. It began with fishermen. At dawn, when the fog still hung low, they claimed to see her standing on the far bank, barefoot, her dress pale and torn, her head bowed. Some said she was humming. Others swore she was sewing something invisible between her fingers, her movements delicate and rhythmic. When they called out, she did not turn, and when they rowed closer, she faded into the mist, leaving only ripples and a scent of burnt silk. At first, no one believed it. Ghost tales were common in the South, and Bellefontaine had earned its share. But when the preacher's own nephew came home pale as bone, trembling and speechless, the whispers became certainty. He said he'd seen her near the willow trees at twilight, sitting on a log, stitching a piece of cloth. He'd stepped closer, and realized she was sewing with no needle at all. The thread was light itself, stretching from her fingertips into the air, weaving patterns that glowed and faded. When she looked up at him, her eyes were gentle, almost kind. But in their depths, he saw the reflection of flames. "She ain't gone," the boy said later, voice shaking. "She's waiting for someone." By then, Mrs. Beauregard's name had all but vanished from polite conversation. The Bellefontaine fire had become a warning, a cautionary tale told by lamplight. The seamstress, the mistress, the house that burned from the inside out. But one person still remembered the truth. Old Liddy, the cook who had worked at Bellefontaine before the war, came forward one evening to tell her story. She said she knew Ruth's mother, a woman named Ada, who had stitched fine lace for the Beauregards. "That girl," Liddy said, "wasn't born to no curse. She was born to finish what her mama started." The listeners leaned in. "Ada died in that house, you see," she continued, her eyes clouded with memory. "But she didn't die by fire. She died of sorrow. Her husband was sold, her child taken, and the mistress, young Miss Clarissa then, promised to keep the baby safe, promised to raise her like her own. But you can't raise what you stole." Gasps filled the room. Someone whispered, "You mean?" Liddy nodded. "That's right. Ruth wasn't just her servant. She was her secret." The room went still. From that night on, the legend of Ruth of Bellefontaine took new shape. She wasn't a vengeful spirit. She was a daughter reclaiming a name, sewing her mother's silence into history's fabric. Each night by the water, her ghostly hands wove the threads of the past back together. Sometimes travelers said they saw lights drifting across the bayou, like candles floating in air. Sometimes they heard the soft sound of fabric tearing, then mending again. A few swore they found scraps of linen caught in the reeds, embroidered with words in a language no one could quite read, half prayer, half lament. Years later, when the land was finally sold, the new owner built a farmhouse where Bellefontaine once stood. During construction, the workers unearthed a small silver box buried near the foundation. Inside was a lock of hair, dark and brittle, tied with a silk ribbon, and a piece of fabric folded so tightly it had to be soaked in water to open. When they did, they found 3 words stitched in fading red thread. "Mother, forgive me." That night, the wind off the bayou rose with a sudden, mournful cry, as if the earth itself had exhaled. And for the first time since the fire, the ruins of Bellefontaine were utterly still. The girl by the water did not appear again, but those who had seen her said she left the world the same way she lived in it, quietly, with her hands at work, sewing her story back into the fabric of time. The years rolled over Bellefontaine like moss swallowing a fallen tree. What was once the grandest mansion in the parish was now little more than cracked stone and tangled ivy. The bayou had reclaimed its own, swallowing walls, wrapping its damp fingers around broken pillars, and pulling memory down into its murky depths. But stories, unlike buildings, don't sink so easily. They cling to breath, to dream, to superstition. The story of Ruth of Louisiana had become something whispered between generations, the seamstress who burned the house of her mistress and sowed her sorrow into the air. Children dared each other to walk near the ruins on moonless nights. Lovers left offerings, bits of lace, needles, ribbons, to earn the seamstress's blessing for faithfulness. Even preachers, who claimed not to believe, avoided saying her name after dark. For though Ruth's ghost had vanished from sight, the air around the old estate carried a strange stillness, as if listening. Then, one spring, a young woman arrived from New Orleans. Her name was Elise Duvernay, a teacher, thin and serious, with ink stains on her fingers and a hunger for forgotten histories. She had heard the legend from a student whose grandmother swore she once saw Ruth by the bayou. Something in the story refused to let her go. Elise came not to hunt ghosts, but to uncover truth. She took a room in a nearby town and began visiting the ruins each day, notebook in hand. She sketched the crumbling foundation, the sunken gardens, and the way the cypress trees leaned as if in mourning. And on her 3rd afternoon, she found something strange, a small shard of porcelain half buried in the mud. When she leaned it, she saw faint blue lines, delicate as veins. It was a fragment of a teacup, the kind once owned by plantation ladies. Elise placed it in her palm and whispered, "Ruth." That night, she dreamed. In the dream, she stood inside the old mansion, whole and gleaming, sunlight filtering through gauzy curtains. The scent of lavender and smoke filled the air. She saw a woman seated by the window, skin the color of cinnamon, eyes calm and deep. Ruth. She was sewing a veil, black as midnight, her needle moving in graceful silence. When Ruth looked up, she smiled, a tired, knowing smile. "You came to finish the story," she said without speaking. Her lips didn't move, but Elise heard the words inside her mind like the hush of a hymn. Elise tried to answer, but her voice failed. Ruth gestured toward the veil in her lap, half finished, trembling between light and dark. "The thread remembers," she said, "but the cloth forgets." Then the sound of distant thunder filled the room, and the dream dissolved into rain. Elise woke before dawn, heart pounding, the smell of smoke faintly lingering in her rented room. She lit a lamp, opened her notebook, and began to write everything she could recall. When she finished, she realized her hands were trembling. In the following days, she uncovered parish records, slave manifests, and a baptismal entry for Ruth, daughter of Ada. There was no surname, only the word Seamstress written in the margin. But beneath it, someone, perhaps a priest, perhaps Ruth herself, had scrawled in faded ink, She left not in anger, but in silence. Elise closed the book and wept. She returned to the ruins one last time, on a quiet evening when the water was still. At the edge of the bayou, she laid the porcelain shard upon the soil, wrapped in a square of linen she had embroidered herself. The initials she stitched into it were simple, R.B., and beneath them, a single red thread dangled loose. As the sun slipped below the horizon, the water caught the last of the light, and for the briefest moment, Elise thought she saw a figure standing across the bank. A woman in white, head bowed, hands folded over her chest. No sound, no wind, just the faintest glimmer of something unseen, as though the veil between past and present had been lifted and the final stitch had been made. When Elise turned to leave, the air seemed to whisper, almost tenderly, "Thank you." And in that instant, the legend of Ruth of Louisiana ceased to be just a ghost story. It became a memory, mended, named, and at last, complete. Long after the ruins of Bellefontaine were swallowed by vines and the bayou's breath, a single relic survived. A portrait. It hung, unnoticed, in a private collection in Baton Rouge, mislabeled, "Unknown Lady," circa 1858. The frame was gilded, though tarnished. The subject, a woman of impossible poise, Mrs. Beauregard, the mistress who once ruled the house Ruth had fled. But there was something wrong with it, something no one could quite name. The eyes. They seemed too alive. Not painted eyes, but watching ones, with the faintest sadness hidden beneath their lacquered serenity. The painting had passed through many hands, collectors, historians, even an old politician who swore it whispered in his sleep. But one rainy evening, when lightning fractured the sky, the portrait fell from the wall. Its frame cracked cleanly across the center, revealing an inner lining beneath the canvas, a second layer, sewn in with a single black thread. The curator who found it, a man named Thaddeus Crane, pried it loose carefully. He expected mold or mildew. What he found instead was fabric, coarse linen, hand-stitched, folded neatly behind the portrait's surface, and upon it, written in faint thread, were the initials R.B. He frowned. "R.B.?" he murmured. "Ruth Beauregard. Toll." But that was impossible. There was no record of such a woman in the Beauregard lineage. That night, Thaddeus brought the cloth to his desk, turning it beneath the lamplight. The thread shimmered strangely, neither fully black nor red, but something in between, a color that seemed to change when the light moved. Beneath the initials was an embroidered motif, a small cypress tree, its roots spreading outward like veins. He leaned closer, and for the briefest second swore he smelled lavender and smoke. The power flickered, the lamp sputtered, and in the dark reflection of the glass case he saw her, a silhouette standing just beyond the edge of light, a woman, head bowed, hands clasped. Thaddeus spun around. The room was empty, only the portrait, lying cracked and silent on the floor. He tried to shake the unease that crept through him, the sense that he'd disturbed something meant to rest. But curiosity, that ancient affliction of scholars, overpowered caution. He began to research the initials. He found parish records, fragments of oral histories, an old ledger listing Ruth, seamstress of the Beauregard house, departed without notice. In one margin, a strange note had been added later. The mistress ordered her portrait the week the seamstress vanished. He stared at the words, heartbeat quickening. What if Ruth had not merely vanished? What if she had left her mark in the only way she could, through the craft that had defined her life? As the storm deepened outside, Thaddeus placed the portrait back onto his easel and began examining the paint. Under ultraviolet light, faint outlines appeared, almost invisible to the naked eye. A thin veil painted over the mistress's figure, a pattern too intricate, too personal to be coincidence. It wasn't part of the original work. It was stitched, not with brush or pigment, but with thread pressed into the shade. Wet paint itself. Thread woven into oil, hidden beneath layers of varnish. A secret signature. Ruth had left her final rebellion in the art itself, sowing her defiance beneath the mistress's painted smile. The veil, once invisible, now shimmered faintly in the purple light, and beneath it, the shape of another woman's face seemed to emerge in the brushwork, as if Ruth had embedded her own reflection there. Thaddeus staggered back, trembling. He could no longer tell where the mistress ended and the seamstress began. Two women bound together, one by cruelty, the other by craft, merged in a portrait that refused to die. He locked the museum door that night, but as he turned the key, a sound rippled through the stillness. Faint, deliberate, unmistakable. The soft pull of thread through cloth. He froze. The sound came again, closer, rhythmic, like a seamstress finishing her work. The lights flickered once more, and the faint outline of a veil drifted across the painting's surface, fluttering as if caught in a phantom wind. When morning came, the portrait was gone. The frame lay empty, the canvas stripped bare, but in the quiet of the curator's desk, one thing remained: a spool of black thread, unwound, coiled like smoke, and upon the wooden reel, a single word etched in a trembling hand. Finished. The years moved on, and yet the tale of Bellefontaine did not fade. It lingered like humidity in the Louisiana air, something you could feel pressing against your skin even if you couldn't name it. People stopped speaking the name Ruth, but they still crossed themselves when they passed the ruins. And every spring, when the cypress trees dropped their moss into the bayou, someone always claimed they saw a woman there, bent over the water, as if mending something unseen. In a small church near Natchez, a nun kept an old veil wrapped in linen. It was said to have come from Bellefontaine, woven from threads so fine they shimmered even in shadow. No one knew how it had survived the fire or who had brought it there, but the nuns whispered that sometimes, late at night, they heard the faint hum of a needle dragging through fabric from the locked chest where the veil lay. One evening, Sister Magdalene, the youngest of them, decided to see it for herself. The others told her to leave it be. That cursed cloth had no place among holy relics. But curiosity has a sound of its own, a rhythm that beats like temptation in the heart. She crept into the storage room after Vespers, candle trembling in her hand. The veil was folded neatly inside its chest, gray as moonlight, untouched by dust. She reached for it, and found that her fingers brushed something wet. Her candle dipped. Wax spilled down her wrist. When she looked again, the veil shimmered like oil on water. She lifted it gently. It was heavier than she expected, woven so tightly it felt almost alive. When she raised it to the light, faint shapes appeared in the fabric, patterns too deliberate to be accidental, tiny stitches forming faces, silhouettes, eyes, all watching her. And then she saw the initials, barely visible at the hem. RBA. Chill climbed her spine. She whispered, "Ruth Beauregard," not knowing why she said it aloud. At that moment, the candle flickered out. The dark folded in around her like cloth, and from somewhere within it she heard the unmistakable sound of a needle piercing fabric. Soft, steady, deliberate. She froze. "Who's there?" No answer. Only the rhythmic pull of thread, closer now. Magdalene stumbled backward, the veil still clutched in her hand. The sound followed, stitch by stitch, until she fled the room, slamming the chest shut behind her. The next morning, the Mother Superior found her trembling before the altar, the veil laid across it like an offering. Magdalene tried to explain, but her voice faltered. All she could say was, "It's not finished." Word spread quickly, not through the church, but through the town. People whispered again about Bellefontaine, about the seamstress who disappeared, but whose work never ceased. Some said Ruth had cursed her final creation, sewing the souls of those who wronged her into her cloth. Others believed she'd simply woven her story into fabric, so she'd never be forgotten. But legends bend, like light through mist. What endured were the sightings, quiet, fleeting, always by water. Women who washed clothes by the bayou swore they sometimes saw a veil drifting along the surface, trailing against the reeds, untouched by current. And on windless nights, the soft hum of a needle could still be heard, as though someone was sewing beneath the cypress roots. Years later, a local historian tried to locate the veil. The church had long since burned in another storm, and all that remained was a melted candlestick and fragments of charred linen. Yet when he examined the fabric under magnification, he found something impossible. The weave contained no known pattern. Each thread crossed itself, looping in unnatural, intricate symmetry, as though a human hand hadn't made it. When he held it to the light, one last image appeared, faint but unmistakable. A woman's face, serene and strong, her eyes half lowered, her mouth set in quiet defiance. The seamstress, Ruth of Louisiana, had not vanished. She had only changed her medium. Her silence had become her legacy, woven into the veil that bore her name. And as the story passed from one generation to another, mothers warned their daughters never to sew after midnight. For in that stillness, they said, the air might shift, the thread might tighten, and if you listened closely enough, you might hear her. The whisper of the needle, the ghost of the seamstress, finishing what she began. By the time the 20th century rolled in, Bellefontaine was no longer a place of memory. It was a ghost swallowed by green. The bayou had claimed what the fire could not, its waters seeping into the bones of the old house, carrying whispers through the reeds. But the land still breathed. Hunters spoke of finding rusted iron gates half buried beneath vines. Children from nearby parishes dared each other to approach the ruins at dusk, swearing they'd heard someone humming behind the trees. It was on such a dare that young Clara Beaumont went. She was 16, stubborn, and reckless in the way only those untouched by loss can be. Her grandmother had told her the stories of the seamstress who disappeared, Ruth, the silent woman who worked beneath the cypress trees. Clara never believed in ghosts, but she did believe in stories, and sometimes that's enough to pull a person toward the dark. The ruins stood like teeth breaking through the swamp. What had once been marble steps were now slick with moss. The air smelled of wet stone and iron. As Clara moved deeper inside, she noticed the strange hush. No birds, no crickets, only the faint creak of the wood, as if the house were exhaling. She reached what remained of the parlor, where ivy trailed through broken windows. A beam of sunlight caught on something near the fireplace. Fabric. Faded, gray, delicate. Her heart stuttered. It was a scrap of cloth, half buried in the soil. She pulled gently, and the earth released it with a sigh. The fabric shimmered faintly, its threads catching light even in shadow. At its edge, a single embroidered letter, R. She smiled nervously. "Ruth?" she whispered. The ground shifted. Something creaked above. When she looked up, the air was filled with dust, motes swirling like ash. The parlor door she'd entered through began to close, though there was no wind, slowly, soundlessly. Clara froze. Then, a soft hum, low, rhythmic, a woman's voice humming an old tune, mournful and tender. It came from deeper in the house. She followed it, past the dining room, where shattered china lay among ferns, to a corridor swallowed by shadow. The hum grew clearer, accompanied by another sound, the soft pull of thread. Her heart raced. "Hello?" No answer. At the corridor's end was a door, its paint peeled to the bone. She reached for the knob and pushed. The door creaked open to reveal a small sewing room, or what was left of one. A warped table, rusted scissors, and there, on the far wall, a mirror cracked into spiderwebs. But she wasn't alone. In the reflection she saw her, a woman seated at the table, head bowed, needle glinting in her hand. Her skin was pale, her dress a dull gray, her face hidden by a thin veil. She moved with slow precision, stitching something Clara couldn't see. The girl spun around. The chair was empty, only the faint shimmer of dust in the air. When she turned back toward the mirror, the woman was standing, closer now. The veil fluttered faintly, though there was no wind, and for an instant Clara could see her face, kind, sorrowful, impossibly calm. "Ruth," she whispered. The woman's hand lifted, not in threat, but in offering. She held out the needle, gleaming faintly like silver drawn from fire. Clara reached forward, her fingertips brushing the mirror's surface. The hum stopped. The world fell silent. And then the glass cracked again, splintering across Ruth's reflection. Yet her figure did not vanish. It lingered, eyes fixed on Clara, lips parting as if to speak. "Finish it," the seamstress said softly. The girl stumbled back, heart pounding, the word echoing through her skull. When she looked again, the mirror was empty. Only her reflection stared back, and in her hand, though she didn't remember taking it, she held the needle. Outside, the bayou winds began to rise. Cypress leaves swirled like smoke. Somewhere beyond the water, the low hum returned. Softer now, almost pleading. Clara dropped the needle and ran. When she looked back from the tree line, the house was gone. Not crumbled, not ruined, but gone, as if it had never existed at all. Only the shimmer of the veil drifted across the swamp, glinting under the fading sun. And from that night on, Clara Beaumont never spoke of what she saw. But in her sewing chest, wrapped in linen, she kept one thing for the rest of her life, a single spool of black thread coiled neatly beside a cracked mirror shard. Some stains, they say, are not of blood or time. They're of memory, woven deep, refusing to fade. The bayou remembers. Even when the people forget, the water holds what history dares to bury. Beneath its green skin, between the cypress knees and drifting moss, stories breathe, slow, steady, eternal. And on nights when the fog rolls in thick as wool, those who live near the old Bellefontaine tract swear they still hear it, the hum of a woman sewing in the dark. Time had turned the legend of Ruth into a whisper, a tale told by grandmothers to quiet children, but legends have a way of calling back to those who listen. And one evening, almost a century after Clara Beaumont's night in the ruins, a young archivist named Eliza Ward came to Louisiana to find what remained of the Beauregard estate. She wasn't a believer in ghosts. She was a scholar, trained in dust and ink. She came with gloves, notebooks, and a box of documents recently unearthed from an old courthouse in St. Landry Parish. Among them, a letter, unsigned, dated 1860. If I am never seen again, know that my silence is my choice. I have sown all that I must. What I leave behind will speak for me. The handwriting was elegant, precise. The letter was stitched at the bottom, not sealed, sewn shut with black thread. Eliza knew at once, this was no ordinary note. She followed the paper trail to the swamp, to the spot marked only as Bellefontaine Ridge. The land was silent save for frogs and the far-off croak of herons, yet the air seemed charged, not menacing, but heavy with the weight of waiting. She walked among the cypress roots until her flashlight caught something, a small iron post, half swallowed by earth. At its base lay what looked like a patch of fabric, woven into the soil, fused with moss and time. It shimmered faintly, catching the light like moonlit water. Kneeling, she brushed the dirt away. Beneath the fabric, she found something else, an old thimble, tarnished but intact, and inside it, a folded scrap of parchment, the edges sealed, not with wax, but with black thread. She hesitated. The wind shifted. The air smelled faintly of lavender and smoke. She pulled the thread free. The parchment unfolded. There was no ink, only the faint imprint of stitches forming words. The veil is never finished. The hum began then, so soft, she thought it was her own breath. But it grew, layered, like many women humming together, low and resonant. It came from the trees, from the ground, from the water. Eliza froze, her light trembling in her hand. The reflection in the bayou surface rippled, and for an instant she saw them. Dozens of women, faces serene, eyes downturned, each with a needle in hand, sewing along an invisible seam that stretched across the swamp. At the center stood one figure, veiled, still, the air around her shimmering with faint silver thread. "Ruth," Eliza whispered. The figure lifted her head. Her face was neither young nor old, but eternal, carved from sorrow and grace. Her eyes met Eliza's, and in that gaze was everything unsaid, every silence history had swallowed. Then, as if caught by wind, the vision faded. The hum softened into the sighing of the trees. The veil dissolved into May. Scent. When Eliza looked down again, the patch of fabric was gone. Only the thimble remained, empty, gleaming faintly. She returned to Baton Rouge days later, shaken but changed. Her colleagues dismissed her story as imagination, the product of exhaustion and swamp air. But when they examined the parchment, they found traces of thread pressed into the fibers. Thread that shimmered black and red under the light, just as the curator Thaddeus Crane had described generations before. That night, Eliza placed the thimble and parchment in a museum case labeled Artifact of Unknown Origin, possibly Bellefontaine 19th century. She left the exhibit room and turned off the lights. But the guard who made his rounds later swore he saw something glinting through the glass, faint strands of thread moving, weaving, connecting the parchment and thimble together as if unseen fingers were at work. He thought he heard a hum then, quiet, patient, tender. In the reflection of the case, for just a moment, stood a woman in gray, her face soft beneath a veil, needle poised above her hand. And when dawn came, the museum's first visitor found a single line of new stitching at the bottom of the parchment. Tiny letters, neat and deliberate. Every stitch remembers. The hum of the bayou continues. The cypress trees sway like slow metronomes in the fog. And somewhere between the water and the wind, a seamstress still works. Not in vengeance, not in sorrow, but in remembrance. Her silence was never absence, it was endurance. Her story, once buried, now breathes again, beneath the cypress, through the thread, in every whisper that dares to speak her name. Ruth of Louisiana, the woman who wove her freedom into the fabric of time. The night air hung heavy, wet with the smell of mud and moss. Cicadas cried in endless rhythm, and the swamp breathed like a living thing beyond the estate's iron fences. Ruth walked alone now, her bare feet silent against the earth, the hem of her cotton dress dragging through dew and roots. In her hand she carried a lantern, an old tin thing borrowed from the laundry room, its flame a trembling pearl inside the dark. Behind her, the lights of Bellefontaine faded, swallowed by trees and fog. The mansion's silhouette, once towering and proud, was reduced to a distant flicker, a ghost swallowed by its own sins. She had left without a sound, as she had lived, her exit, a whisper in the hours before dawn. Each step into the swamp was a step into memory. The whisper of her mother's voice seemed to follow her through the reeds. "Keep your silence, Ruth. It will save you." But tonight, silence felt less like salvation and more like a chain. The air thickened, the water deepened. Cypress knees rose like twisted bones from the shallows, and the reflection of her lantern shivered across their roots. Somewhere in the distance, a bell tolled faintly from the town, a reminder that the world still turned beyond this forgotten edge of Louisiana. Ruth had stitched her last dress, hemmed her last lie. She had left the veil behind, the one that shimmered with thread as dark as night, the one she'd woven with more than silk, with secrets. The swamp was her sanctuary now, but it was also her test. The mist rose up around her, cold and unkind, and the frogs fell silent as if the world was holding its breath. Ruth stopped, lantern trembling in her hand. The sound of her name, soft, like a sigh, floated from behind her. "Ruth." She froze. Her pulse thudded against her throat. It wasn't Mrs. Beauregard. That voice was too kind, too distant, like a wind through lace curtains. She turned slowly, raising the lantern. Nothing but fog and trees stared back at her. Still, she felt watched, felt known. Her hand brushed against the small pouch at her waist, the one she'd sewn herself, lined with blue thread. Inside were the things she refused to leave behind, a scrap of her mother's shawl, a rusted thimble, and a single golden pin shaped like a lily. The pin had once belonged to Mrs. Beauregard, but Ruth had taken it, not from greed, but for proof. Proof of everything that had been done under that roof. Thunder rolled, low and distant, and a breeze stirred the moss above her head. The lantern's flame bent sideways, flickering weakly. Ruth knelt by the edge of the black water, setting the lantern down beside her. In its glow, she opened the pouch and touched each item with trembling fingers. The shawl smelled faintly of lavender and smoke. The thimble gleamed with old blood where a needle had once pricked too deep. The golden pin caught the light like a sun in miniature. Ruth stared at it, her lips parting as if to speak, for the first time in months, perhaps years, but no words came. Only a single tear slid down her cheek and vanished into the mud. When she finally rose, the swamp seemed to open before her, a path of silver light reflected from the moon. The lantern burned steady now, no longer afraid. She walked on, deeper into the darkness, the veil of silence she once wore now lifting, thread by invisible thread. Behind her, the wind carried the faintest sound, a creak of the mansion's shutters, a cry of a restless spirit. And somewhere between the whispering cypress and the starlit water, the name, Ruth, drifted once more through the night, softer, almost grateful. She didn't turn back. She didn't need to. For the first time, her silence was her own. The swamp was still as glass when dawn crept over the horizon. Mist clung to the water's surface like thin lace, and the first fingers of sunlight broke through the cypress canopy in pale threads. Ruth stood by the edge, her reflection rippling beneath her feet, half shadow, half flesh. The lantern she had carried through the night had burned down to a weak ember, a trembling heartbeat of light. She sank to her knees, her hands resting on the damp earth. The silence of morning pressed close, broken only by the slow murmur of frogs returning to song. Her eyes drifted to the water where the reflection of Bellefontaine shimmered faintly in the distance. The mansion was far away now, but its image seemed to cling to her, a phantom built from memory, stitched into the corners of her mind. From her pouch, she drew the golden lily pin. It glinted like the last remnant of another life. Beneath its shine, she could still smell Mrs. Beauregard's perfume, heavy gardenia and power. That scent had haunted every room, every breath Ruth took inside that house. It was the smell of command, of cruelty, wrapped in silk. Her fingers closed around the pin until the metal dug into her palm. She remembered the final night at the mansion, the storm outside, the candles trembling on the parlor table, Mrs. Beauregard's voice sharp as a whip. "Do not forget your place, girl," the mistress had hissed. "You were brought here to serve, not to listen." But Ruth had listened. Always. From behind doors, from beneath stairwells, through lace curtains she herself had sewn. She'd heard the mistress's confessions, the debts, the scandals, the missing girl from the quarters, the pastor bribed to stay silent. Each stitch Ruth made had bound those secrets into fabric. The final veil, black as sin and soft as breath, had been the last of them. When Ruth had finished it, Mrs. Beauregard had demurred. Undead, she bring it upstairs to the great mirror room. But when Ruth arrived, the mistress lay on the floor, her body still, her eyes open to nothing. The veil had slipped from her hands and draped across her face like mourning-made flesh. The doctor would later call it heart failure. But Ruth had seen the truth. Guilt had taken her before God could. Now, by the swamp, Ruth held the golden pin over the water. "You'll stay here," she whispered, her voice a ghost breaking free of silence. "All of it will stay here." She let the pin fall. It vanished beneath the surface without a sound, sinking into the dark like a buried lie. For a long while, she watched the ripples fade, her breath unsteady, her heart strangely light. Then, from somewhere behind her, a rustle stirred in the trees. She turned slowly, expecting only wind, but the faint outline of a figure stood beyond the mist. A woman, tall and still, her dress pale and flowing like smoke. Mrs. Beauregard. Ruth didn't move. The figure did not come closer, only raised one hand, as if in farewell. Her face was unreadable, but her eyes were softer now, emptied of malice. Then the image flickered, wavered, and was gone, swallowed by the fog. Ruth exhaled, the sound trembling out of her chest like a prayer. She picked up the lantern, its last drop of flame dying into smoke. The swamp glowed faintly gold now, alive with morning. Somewhere far off a rooster crowed, the world returning to itself. Ruth stood, wiping her hands on her dress, her silence no longer heavy, but clean. The path ahead led deeper into the trees, away from Bellefontaine, away from servitude and sorrow. And so she walked, slow, steady, free, until the mansion's ghost disappeared behind her for good. The veil, the pin, the mistress, all left behind. Only Ruth remained, and for the first time her name felt like a beginning. Night fell heavy over the bayou. The sky, thick with storm clouds, pulsed red and gold as if the heavens themselves were aflame. Ruth stood far down the dirt road that wound away from Bellefontaine, the hem of her dress soaked from the swamp's edge. She hadn't meant to turn back, but something in her, a deep ache of unfinished sorrow, had made her pause. Behind her, over the treetops, she saw it. A glow. At first faint, like candlelight caught in the mist, but then it grew, swelling into a feverish blaze. The mansion was burning. The wind carried the scent of smoke and magnolia, sweet, choking, unforgettable. Flames climbed the white columns, devouring silk drapes and polished mahogany, consuming portraits whose painted smiles had watched over a century of lies. The great house of Bellefontaine, proud and cruel, was being undone. Ruth watched as the fire caught the upper windows. For a fleeting moment, she thought she saw figures moving within. The silhouettes of servants, the restless ghosts of those who had labored in silence. Then she realized what she saw wasn't flesh, but memory. The house itself was remembering. Every echo, every whisper, every secret it had swallowed now screamed through its burning walls. A sudden crack split the night, the roof collapsing in on itself, sending a plume of sparks into the sky. They scattered like fireflies, drifting down toward the bayou's still water. Ruth's heart trembled. She could have walked away. She should have, but her feet carried her forward. Through the smoke and cinders, she approached the gate, the same iron arch she had walked beneath every morning. Its hinges had melted and twisted, but she pressed through. The heat lashed her face, her lungs burning with every breath. Still, she walked closer. Inside the garden, the camellias burned white, their petals turning to ash mid-bloom. The grand front door was hung open, the same one she had polished 100 times. Behind them, fire danced like something alive, roaring and snarling through the halls. She stopped at the threshold. Once she had entered this house as a servant, silent, invisible. Now she stood as its witness, its judge. "Let it fall," she whispered. For a moment she thought she heard another voice answer her, soft, almost kind. Mrs. Beauregard's voice. It came from within the flames. "You always did your work too well, Ruth." The words were neither cruel nor mocking. They were tired, as if the mistress herself had laid down her pride at last. Then the ceiling gave way, and the sound was swallowed by the roar of fire. Ruth stepped back as embers rained around her. One landed on her sleeve. She slapped it away, trembling. Her eyes lifted to the tower window above, where the lace curtains she had sewn years ago fluttered in the heat. They glowed, then turned to black threads curling into nothing. She thought of the other women, the maids, the cooks, the girls who had come and gone with heads bowed. Somewhere in this blaze, their ghosts were finding light. A gust of wind swept through the courtyard, and the flames surged higher, twisting upward like a serpent of gold. The great staircase collapsed with a groan that sounded almost human. Ruth stepped back to the road, the glow of the fire behind her casting her shadow long across the mud. She did not weep. She did not turn away. When the final wall crumbled, sparks drifted into the bayou and hissed out in tiny bursts of steam. The reflection of the fire shimmered on the water, red fading into silver, silver fading into dark. By dawn, nothing would remain but char and cypress. And Ruth, a seamstress who had unstitched an empire one thread at a time, would keep walking toward the morning, the fire's glow fading behind her like the closing of a curse.